Hey guys, welcome back. I am Templar, and welcome to the Order if any of y'all are now just joining. Now, in this type of video, I am going to be talking about the so-called uniform design of the, well, ancient antiquity. Now, when I say uniform, I'm using it as technically referring to a type of group or type of meaning behind it. In other words, it's kind of complicated. In other words, let's actually take a look through antiquity from the very beginning, such as, like, say, the Bronze Age and such, to, well, technically to the modern colonial versions that we think of. Now, as well, I was reading through my ancient Celtic type of information from Tim Newart, or as well Angus McBride, of which they do actually talk about in this of like what the Celtic warriors would have been. And pretty much, I've also never seen a video on ancient antiquities uniforms. So I decided to myself, well, might as well talk about it. Now, when we think of uniforms, we normally think of the modern military design. Now, this is kind of actually can be seen in history through our times, such as, say, for example, we all know, for example, the British Red Coat, or including the American Union uniform that we see in the American Civil War. But here's the thing, without the uniform, we can accidentally always mistake somebody on the battlefield. And especially if we see, like, say, a, well, type of battle that goes into what we might call a, well, complete skirmish, a complete, mess, a massacre. In other words, a whole army division is technically fighting in one whole group and accidentally, well, killing each other. This can actually be seen at the Battle of First Manassas, or the Battle of First Bull Run, of which if we see in that conflict, we see both sides, both the North and the South, actually using mixed uniforms. In fact, the North mainly having blue uniforms, while the Confederate Army has gray, green, blue, light blue, and including actually just regular random colorizations, of which later on after the battle, the Confederate Army decided to just wear gray for their officers, while the rest of the Confederate Army would pretty much just wear regular outfits, pretty much just meaning the term rebel. But you gotta admit though, it's kind of impressive though, because back then it was kind of necessary to understand your allies on the battlefield. Kind of like the same with the Confederate flag of how it got its origins from that era. But I guess I'll talk about that some other time, probably by the month of February. Now, how did people in antiquity actually understand of whose side they were on? How did they exactly know each other? How did they pretty much understand whose side they were on just by understanding them by looking at them? Well, back then we always thought, historians, especially back like before the 90s and including back during the time of the Victorian period, they always believed that people kind of massacred themselves, that it was a clash of idiocy and such. And it kept going on like that until, said, the British Empire at the time. Which, that is the most dumbest thing you could probably believe in history books. And in truth, many historians today from the 90s and pretty much in modern day actually are starting to believe something else. In fact, some historians have actually even read off of even Greek and Roman texts about the ancient Celts. How so? Well, it's kind of like this. The ancient Celts actually did have a type of coexistent type uniform. However, it wasn't like a uniform we think of today. For example, when we think of uniform, as I said, it's mainly on the body. This uniform, however, was on the shield. Now, as y'all can see, my Roman scutum, for example, it has said red, yellow, brownish, black, and including a green color. Now, that's my point. And this can actually refer to the tribe, not the symbols, but including the only, well, colorization of the shield. In fact, it's stated by the Romans and Greeks that it was stated that the shield had many designs, but yet was fully colorized in the same patterns. In other words, it may have had different designs on there. It might have had this design, that design, or including the same design in general, but including it was always painted with the same type of colors. So in other words, I could have said my other scutum here, which y'all can see has green and yellow, of which, as y'all can tell, is, well, pretty much of another type of tribe. But in doing so, that this green and yellow one could pretty much also be a reference onto another tribe, and this tribe could probably have red and yellow for their tribe, and it kind of goes on and on. And in fact, this is actually one way you can tell the difference from one Celtic tribe to another. In fact, Romans such as Julius Caesar, or including Claudius and Nero and such, or any Roman general in history, actually could tell the difference between each Celtic tribe in history just from looking at their shields, and especially during the time of the Boudiccan Revolt. Not all the Britons were technically slaughtered, only those that participated, or including their allies, in the conflict. So you could see why not all Celts were destroyed in history books by the Romans. At least that's a good thing. Now though, let's also talk about the Greeks. How can you tell the difference about the Greek militaries? Well, thanks to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is surprising they got this accurate enough, it's actually stated that the Greeks actually had a type of uniform system even before the Punic Wars. Well, I want to say Punic Wars, but I would not have to say Punic Wars. Before the conflict with said cultures such as Persia. Well, it's actually stated that both Athens and Sparta, who went against each other during the type of conflicts they would pretty much always be in, it was actually stated that Sparta and its allies would wear red, or a white tunic with red outlines along the borders of the tunic, while the Athens and its allies would have actually worn blue and a blue outline. So you could see why that was kind of easy one to tell the difference for. Now I hear you already. Templar, why didn't they do it on their shields? Well, that's the thing. The reason they didn't do it on their shields is kind of ceremonial. In fact, Greeks kind of viewed a form of showing off their family. In other words, my family was at this battle, look at my shield. So yeah, you can see why, even though the family shield was seen, sometimes even family shields were divided because of families on either side of the conflict. Which, though, even if you could actually still see the uniform design, it wasn't actually also on just the shield, it was also just on the colorization of the tunics. So yes, that was impressive, but what about their armor? Did the armor have something to do? Slightly. Now, it's stated that sometimes the armor was colorized, or including if you wore bronze armor, for example, then it would technically be, I want to say, detailed with designs of your family or your household, while if you were to wear said type of Lionel thorax armor, it would have been painted with design work on it. So in other words, it would still actually represent the family. But now, what about Romans? What did Romans' uniform look like? Well, besides the shield, like we see here, which this shield would have been used in the Punic Wars and including the Gallic Wars with Julius Caesar, it's stated that the Roman legionnaires were actually, especially if you were to actually see in Roman civil wars, for example, Romans would have actually had a very diverse uniform design, not just on their shields, but including on with their armor. Why their armor and kit? Well, it's actually stated with the following. In fact, kind of take this shield for example. Romans would have actually decorated their shields for a number of reasons. 1, to represent their legion. 2, to represent where they're stationed. And 3, so that way they don't get killed by allies. In fact, that type of design work kept going on from the early Roman Republic to technically the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and even still on beyond. Now, in doing so, Romans did also do something else. They actually also, instead of putting it on the tunic, it stated they would have actually done something else. Now, don't get me wrong, they would have actually used the tunic for something, actually in general, but in doing so it was something else, but I'll get to that very soon. Now, in order to tell the difference between each division, they would have actually used their equipment. For example, their helmet, their armor, their sword, or technically their scabbard and their sword, and including their belt, their kingdom. Everything upon them would actually represent the region they were in. How? Well, it's like this. on the scabbard of a sword, or including the sword hilt itself, the entire scabbard and hilt would be decorated with design work of the region they were in. In other words, the sword would technically be different comparing from one region to the other. In other words, I'm a legionnaire of Africa, I'm a legionnaire in Gaul. These two would be represented both in their scabbard and including their shield and equipment. But what about their tunic? Well, their tunic would be a little different. How so? Well, in early Roman Republican times, it was stated that during the time of the Roman Republic, till we get technically somewhere during the 3rd century crisis, it was stated that the Roman legion's military kind of changed it up. How so? Well, it's like this. Red would be represented for the Roman Marines, while blue would represent the Navy, while white would represent the Army. And then later on, the Romans would later on have auxiliary units, which would wear different type of colorations, such as one for cavalry, one for barbarian soldiers that are now fighting for the empire, or including some that were meant for archers. However, there were different colorizations, but those ones went out of style, and this went back in. But white was represented for the main army itself. In other words, those that weren't technically invading Britain. So red was seen in Britain, but not in the rest of the entire empire. So that could explain a lot. Now though, in historical standard point though, as I stated, as soon as we reached the 3rd century crisis, it's stated that the Roman legions actually even adopted the form of actually placing the ranking on the Roman tunics. How? Well, that's the thing. Different dyes represent a different rank. In other words, if you were, say, like a buck private to a sergeant, it would technically be a white. Or it would be red for a Roman sergeant, or in this case, a Roman, I want to say, maybe centurion, for example, to a lieutenant or something like that, including a Roman officer, and then a Roman emperor who would have purple. But that's the thing, it would go on, and sometimes they would be detailed with a type of embroidered belt upon the tunic, but of which was including all sewn onto the tunic, as I'm stating. But as I said, that would technically go on from the empire and still be used in the Byzantine military, of which would definitely represent each legion. And doing so, you cannot mistake each legion for its own version. For example, say if like I have a Roman Civil War, for example, and we have shields like this. And this legion shield would probably say have this symbol for one legion, while another legion would probably have said a circle. Now they'd both be painted the same way, but the problem is they'd both have different symbols. That's the incredible part about it. And the Romans would keep this uniform type factorial reason throughout history. The same with the Greeks with their tunics. But now, let's actually go deep into what actually happened after the fall of the Roman Empire, or the Western Roman Empire. What did we see then? Well, that's the thing. When we take a look there, it's actually very incredible. For example, who took over the Western Roman Empire? The Germans, or the Germanic people, whatever you want to pronounce them as. In doing so, we actually see the Lombards, the Franks, and such. So how did people understand them? How did people, well, here's the thing. You see this image here? This is a Lombard here. And, well, how can I tell the difference between him and other Germanic people? Well, that's the thing. It was actually stated that the Germanic people actually could understand their own people from other people, not because of language, because language back then was extremely different. Because all of it was technically unified. The problem is, they didn't like each other because of their tribes. But the one way you can actually tell the difference is actually because of their hairstyles. Now, this is a very impressive part in history books. Why? Well, how should I put this? Lombards would have actually grown out their beards, hence the name Lombard, while a Frankish warrior would have actually used a weapon known as a Francisca, a throwing axe, in which they would even had shaved pretty much their entire head. Now, what do I mean, like, shave their entire head? I mean like a Marine Corps haircut, like that military haircut that we always see. In other words, they shave the entire sides while they leave the rest out to grow. So pretty much, as well, even shave their regular beards. So it's kind of like what we might see with the Norman conquest of 1066, of which that's what they would have looked like. Now, also in general tongue, it was also stated that the ancient warriors from history, such as even the Saxons and the Danes, for example, those two cultures were nearly identical. So how did they tell the difference? Well, as I stated, with their hair design. And it's like this. It was stated that the Saxons grew out their mustaches while also growing out their hair, while Vikings, on their hand, like Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, or including Finns, would have grown out their hair and their beards, and as well actually braided them. This would have actually made their historical design. Now, another way they could also tell the difference between one group and the other was because also the painting of their shields as well. However, if we ever look at a Viking shield, they look extremely different. So how are you supposed to tell the difference? Well, thanks to Vikings, the series, which I think this is the only thing you get right, is that they have painted shields that all look the same. And this represented the place that they lived in. Why? Well, here's the thing. Paint is kind of, well, hard to get your hands on, especially back then. And to make it, you gotta actually have the type of resources in the area to make it. The more resources, the more paint. So, there you go. Now, in doing so, it's actually stated that the Vikings, Saxons, and many other cultures did this throughout time. In fact, this would still go on, including to the time of the High Medieval Age. In other words, after the years of 1066, during the medieval period. Now, in this point in time, we can actually see the later on type of, well, form of understanding the proper uniform, such as the surcoat. Why the surcoat? Well, that's the thing. The surcoat is that type of symbol that represents of who you are on the side of. In other words, pretty much, this is representing, I am from England, I am from France, I am from this region. In other words, you don't mistake the other guy. In fact, that was because of the First Crusade that they ended up wearing it. Now, in doing so, that's actually how you can actually understand the different groups. And in fact, even the surcoat was even used by peasant military, and including this has actually been seen, the surcoat being used from the very beginning of the High Medieval Age, technically until we reached like the very pretty much end of the entire Knight in general. Why and how is that even possible? Well, because it's a good uniform design. And in fact, this uniform design work is even seen in a video game called Kingdom Come Deliverance, which is surprisingly historically accurate. Now, also another way you can also tell a form of uniform design was the coat of arms, by placing on a shield. Now, as you'll get to see, I still haven't actually put my coat of arms on here yet. I'm still designing on my own, but yeah. Now, if y'all can tell, a coat of arms is a type of symbol, meaning that it's also been on the surcoat. Now, it doesn't just represent the country, it also represents your house. For example, let's take, say, the clan of Gunn, for example, and the clan MacFarlane in Scotland. Those two type of groups, they would have actually had the coat of arms of their type of groups. They wouldn't have had their own country. Otherwise, it would just get too damn confusing of whose side they were on. Now, in doing so, the only ones that would technically use the type of surcoats and including the coat of arms of their country, such as say England, Scotland, Ireland, France, and such as blah blah blah. They would have actually only been used by the king and his bodyguards. In other words, the main force that would have fought for the king. We could see this with King Richard the Lionheart, who would pretty much have his main military group compared to the rest of the peasant military group that were fighting with him. Now, in doing so, can actually be seen incredibly throughout history. And this is actually the also awesome part about it, is that the coat of arms is actually impressive because it's also seen on the battle flag. However, it's what we might call as a very messed up form in history. Now, here's the thing though, what about the medieval mercenary? You might ask, which, thank you for bringing that up. It's actually impressive though, because the medieval mercenary, for example, would not actually have their own coat of arms. They would have actually had what you might call a sewn-on patch, a patchwork design. What's a patchwork? Well, it's kind of like this. Take a gambeson and you take said cloth and you have it sewn on your gambeson. Now, in doing so, a lot of times mercenary groups were pretty much mistaken for other groups. So in doing so, they would actually attack medieval knights rather than actually be mistaken. take for example, like I get my mercenary band, we're called the Black Hand Division. So in doing so, we're a mercenary band to have the black hand, and then in doing so, we have to have it either sewn onto our chest or on our side. In other words, our gambeson arm. This way, we can actually still have it representing us, and we're not mistaken for the enemy. Now, in some general sense, some armor was painted. I don't know if that's true, but I'm not even gonna try and swing at that for a minute. Now, there is also another type of armor that is known as the doubler. What's a doubler? A doubler is a type of armor that's also better than a surcoat because it acts as an armor and it acts as a uniform. In fact, it is seen in Kingdom Come Deliverance, which I dare y'all to actually see. In fact, this type of, impressive part in uniform is impressionable and yet is also impressive. But the thing is, we don't see mercenaries wearing most of these because it's never seen. Mercenaries are a dime a dozen. They're most of the time just cannon fodder, for example. Now, what about other forms of way that we could see this in European culture? Well, by the time we reach the Renaissance, the type of jerkin, leather jerkin designs were now being put in, replacing the gambeson, but yet still the patch was on the chest or the side. Now, in doing so, they were actually replaced from the mercenary band design was actually now placed with a royal seal, for example. How does that work? Well, it's kind of like this. Take, for example, the Queen of England, for example, like the Kingdom of England has its symbol and the Kingdom of France has its symbol. So in other words, the French have a cross with the French cross on it, while the groups known as, we say, England would probably have the Union Jack or something that represented their crown, or including maybe in a crown itself. Some say it was a lion, depending. But by the time we reach, say, the English Civil War, that's when it gets a little hard to understand the difference between the two. In doing so, that's why the British, or the New Modeled Army, known as the Parliamentarians, designed the so-called redcoats. So we can see that part in history. But now that brings me to another group, the Scottish. Now how can you tell the difference between the Scots and one Scottish group and the other? Well, it's kind of easy to understand: the kilt. However, the kilt would still not be in fashion until the 1700s, or including the 1600s, which, you gotta admit, it's kind of reason why that armor design didn't technically come out. But some say even during the 1500s it might have come out then. I'm not too certain. No, I'm not gonna fire a pistol at it to make sure I don't get attacked by any historians on this. Now, in doing so, it actually is stated that the Scots would have actually had different tartans to represent their clan. And in doing so, these were actually made by the type of, substances that they had around them. In other words, I could take a thistle, I could take mud, I could take this, and put it all together, and boom, there's my colorization. But, it then doesn't work like that, but you get my point. In doing so, many clans have different versions. So in doing so, it represents them. So yeah, that's an easy way to actually understand of how they didn't accidentally kill each other. However, if it came to a massive civil war between one clan and the other, such as like we see with the Battle of Culloden, a lot of Scots would have actually worn said garments in their Glengarries in order to represent on whose side they were, such as the king's side or not. So you can see my point. But what about Eastern Europe? Did it also do the same? Well, not with kilts, no. But with the surcoat and the coat of arms, yes. But mostly with the coat of arms. In fact, the coat of arms was still pretty much in use throughout every culture in history in Europe. And in fact, this has actually been used, as I said, in the medieval period, it was used throughout history. That's actually impressive to its historical form. But I hear you already. But Templar, what about Asia? What exactly did their gear and armor look like? Well, their form of uniform was extremely different compared to Europe, and it was actually a little more cohesive and design work than what we might think. For example, the most easiest way to explain it is technically by far of how it was made and how it was seen. How so? Well, it's like this. Let's take Korea, China, and the rest of Europe, Asia at the time. How so? Well, it's kind of like this. They would have actually worn a type of uniform that would be extremely different. How so? Well, take a look at the Terracotta Army. Why the Terracotta Army? Well, they would have actually, if you see technically very closely, they wear something around their necks. This is a scarf they were wearing. And these would have been painted with the type of coloration of the type of dynasty they were part of. Why? Well, it's kind of like this. Take, for example, I'm part of the Qin dynasty, or the Zhao, or the Han, or whatever. They would have had different colors, which I know this sounds very weird, but they would have had different colors that would have been cheap enough and affordable enough to be used as scarves on the battlefield. In fact, in the anime Kingdom, which I actually did a video on myself a while back, which y'all can actually see, so I'll put a link in the description, actually does show a incredible form in history of why they would actually do that. In fact, it's stated that the Chinese, Koreans, and many other people in history put a scarf around them in order to represent themselves. In other words, this is my country, I'm representing this, so that way I don't get myself killed by my ally. In fact, it was kind of very easy to accidentally mistake one group for the other and accidentally kill themselves. But now, what about Japan? Did it do this? No. Japan actually had a different form of uniform equipment design. How so? Well, it's kind of like this. It was seen like that for the low peasant, of which hardly had any chance to, get any type of good armor like that. Problem is, though, it's stated that the samurai actually used painted armor. Now, I'm not certain if this is true or not, or just a big jackass myth by some idiot anime fans, but meh. Anyways, it was stated in history books that samurais actually did paint some armor. They would have probably been black, or red, or yellow. There would have been different colors depending on which side they were part of. In fact, if we take a look at the movie The Last Samurai, it kind of does show a little bit of a description on their uniform design before they turned into a modern military. Now, if we take a look at this, we can actually see that the samurai warriors would have even actually adorned flags upon their backs in order to represent of whose family they were fighting for. They're fighting for their family's household, so pretty much they had to have it on their back. Now, in doing so, though, some samurais were even stated to have actually worn a, I want to say a silk ribbon design belt around their waist, but I think this might have gone over the armor to represent of their family household. So maybe they did the same thing as a peasant, I'm not so certain. But it is stated also they would have probably also worn, a peasant would have probably also worn a painted hat. I'm not certain if that's true, but I'm not even going to poke at it with a 1,000-foot pole. Now, in doing so, these type of forms of military type cohesion actually kept the Japanese military to understand of whose side they were on for hundreds of years, and still it can be seen in history books. But now, I hear y'all also probably might want to know, okay, what about the uniforms of Africa? Well, Africa and the Middle East are kind of actually both a rare and hard description, though. But I will do my best. Now, unlike Europe, they didn't exactly have any surcoats, nor did they have any coat of arms. So, what exactly did they use? What exactly did they wear? Well, the best way to describe them is, I guess you might say they did have a coat of arms, but I wouldn't call it that. Why? No, it's different. In fact, for example, let's take Shaka Zulu and the Zulu warrior. What exactly did they use? Well, it's stated that Shaka Zulu and his warriors were described to be wearing type of, well, what they were wearing. In fact, it's like this. They would wear grass skirts, or, well, I wouldn't call it a skirt, but you get my point. They would have actually also used shields, and including a type of headband. This headband would represent where they are from. Now, Shaka Zulu and his people would have only used these, and as well, the shields would have been painted to represent of where they are from. Now, would they have different designs? Maybe, or maybe not. It depends. Problem is, though, it's kind of hard to describe the Shaka Zulu warrior. Now, in the Anglo-Zulu War, or Zulu War, whatever you want to pronounce it as, It's actually stated that during this point in conflict, it was stated that Shaka Zulu's that the warriors of the Zulu would have actually used types of weapons, and of which were extremely different compared to that of the other tribes in Africa, and including their shields were all of a cohesion type group. So if you think about it, they all had the same colorization. They all had the same look. They all had the same markings to represent a Zulu tribe. So that explains that. But what about other tribes of Africa? Did they also do the same? Well, if I was to go with, say, Arab nomadic people, they would have actually had something else. How so? Well, take a look at this image from the mummy, the first mummy, back when it was incredible, of which we see black and red for the Magi, and then another colorization of black and white for another group that attacked the French, of which we actually do see a huge describing version of the Arabic people at that time. In fact, Arabic nomads actually did wear this type of version in order to describe their people and of who they were. In fact, different type of Arabic people were actually stated by both colonialists from France, England, and many other groups, including during the time of the Ottoman War, or including the fall of the Ottoman Empire, that it was stated that Arabic people actually did wear their nomadic type robes in order to describe their tribe. And in doing so, they actually described it just by looking at them. Not by their language, but because of what they were wearing. In which, that's actually how many British military forces knew of how not to accidentally kill the wrong group. So it made sense at the time, but it didn't work out so well. But what about the rest of Africa? Did they do the same? Well, let's take a look at Egypt, for example. Now, Egypt, this is the hard part to explain. In historical standards, Egypt did have its own form of uniform, but it was slightly different. Unlike it being on the shield, unlike it being with the weapons, and unlike it being on their chest, it was on their head. Yeah, I know, here you already tell, but that does not make any sense. Well, as we all call the Egyptian hat, that type of form of guest wear or something, that was actually a form of uniform wear for the military. It described on their area of where they lived. In other words, the one stripe could represent the Nile, one stripe can compare to the region. So it could be a black and red, it can be blue and white, or including red and white. It describes on which region they lived in, including which division they were, especially if the fact of Egypt fell into a civil war. Now, that describes something, if we think about it, but that's the thing. Each tribe in Africa had its own different version, and unfortunately a lot of them were mistaken for another. Ugh. Man, that just wasn't right not happening during the colonial periods. Oof. But now, let's get over to the Americas. Now, this one is going to be slightly easier because it's in my home turf. Why? Because here's the thing, I live in the US and pretty much I live in Texas. And what us Texans are known for with Native Americans is the Comanche and Apache. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people mistaken these two tribes for no apparent reason. But I will also describe the Aztec Jaguar. Why the Aztec Jaguar? Well, here's the thing. Their uniform was unique. Unlike other Native American tribes, they actually had a, well, weird uniform that actually coated their skin. As it's stated. It was stated that they would have worn a jaguar face mask, of which would have actually been made of wood, and would actually look like a jaguar's head, which would cover their own head. Now in doing so, they would have also worn a pelt of a jaguar, either covering their entire body or including their back, representing that they are the beasts of the jungle. Now, there's also the eagle warriors and such that would have also looked just like that, which is incredible by far. So, yeah, that's incredible. But as well, there's also the Native Americans of America. What did they exactly look like? Well, Native American tribes in America had different versions. For example, let's take a look at the Mohawk. Who are the Mohawk? The Native American Mohawk warriors were extremely gruesome warriors during both the 7 Years' War or the American, French and Indian War, or including even the American Revolution. These conflicts that they took part in were extremely gruesome. In fact, they were actually labeled the killers of the colonial period. And in fact, they actually took many sides, the French, the British, and American sides, pretty much throughout time, only to see of who would be best for who. Now, it's stated the Mohawk, the reason they were nicknamed the Mohawk was because of their hairstyle. Why their hairstyle? Here's the thing. Take a look at this image and understand why they were called a Mohawk. Now, the Mohawk warriors actually did have extremely odd mohawks. One of the weirdest one would be extremely tall. And we think 90s punks looked weird. Now, in truth though, this mohawk design was copied by American forces during World War II, especially the 101st Airborne, who copied it along with their face paint and used it on the battlefields of Normandy D-Day during 1944, of which is incredibly badass of the U.S. military to use this, especially to terrify the Germans. And in fact, it was stated the Mohawks were actually one of America's most dangerous native warriors in history, besides the Comanche and Apache. Which brings me to my next two Native American tribes of Texas. Now, here's the hard part to explain, really. The Native Americans of Texas were extremely hard to describe. Why? Well, during the time of the American exhibition to control Texas, they accidentally killed Native American tribes for no apparent reason, just because they didn't understand their differences. In fact, it's like this. An Apache warrior would actually have black and red war paint, or including black war paint with a red scarf over their head. Now this would describe them as, well, an Apache. In fact, Texans knew this because they were dealing with these people for hundreds of years, well, technically for 10 years and such, and in doing so, they pretty much understood them, while the U.S. government, not so much. Now, the Comanche warrior was extremely different. They would have grown out their hair as well, except they would have actually had it flowing out. They wouldn't have had tied it up. And in doing so, they would have actually done war paint. However, they would have done so that it would actually been like polka dots, or would have been swirls or something upon their face and chest. And including it's extremely different compared to an Apache warrior. You see my point here, right? Now, in doing so, these two Native American tribes were mistaken to be identical, but they weren't identical, and Texans knew the difference, of which was kind of the problem. Now, as well, another way we can also tell the difference between uniform designs is their weaponry. Why their weaponry? Well, it's kind of like this. To describe said, as I stated back with, like say, the Roman Legionnaire, for example, they're different weapons, they're different swords for different legions. Now, that can explain something. For example, a uniform design said of I want to say a falcata, for example, would be part of the Celtiberians, of which described later on through history because of it. And as well, with the shield, it could also be describing my region, my living. And in doing so, we can see that throughout culture, there are different groups that had different meanings behind them. So when we think of uniform, don't just think a British redcoat to an American Marine. Think of pretty much all the way back to the Bronze Age. Think back to the times and eras that describe these warriors in history, which impressive by far that we actually still back then had a way of understanding of whose side we were on just by looking at a type of uniform that was different compared to different groups, of which in general I still love by far. Anyways guys, if you all found this helpful, let me know in the comments below. If you all want me to talk anything else by the time after October ends, because I will be going on the horror history month pretty much very soon. Let me know down in the comments below if you want me to cover anything about history related subjects. Let me know down in the comments. Also like and subscribe for more videos, and as well it will also help the channel grow, and as well become part of the order. As well, also check out our Facebook, which y'all can actually even take a look out down below. And as well, if y'all want to be notified extremely quickly, also just click that bell button. Anyways guys, hope to hear from y'all soon again. And this has been Templar, and welcome to the order. Have a great day.